everyone. This is a special edition of Arizona Horizon as we look back on the senator's life and visit with a lot of people with a lot of memories and a lot of thoughts of John McCain. Jonathan Koppell is the Dean of College of Public Service at ASU, and Koppell worked closely with Senator McCain on a series of projects, including the McCain Institute. He joins us now. Dean Koppell, good to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, we were just speaking with Lori Roberts, the columnist of the Arizona Republic, about was he Arizona senator or was he really America's senator? He was America's senator. Why?
Well, I think that was the right question to ask, because there's a natural tendency to say, well, it's a big deal here in Arizona, but maybe everybody else, it's just ho-hum. I think it's a big deal. And I think it's a big deal because in the historical context, John McCain really stands out. And it's funny, if you try to think of the last time we looked at an individual in this way, what comes to my mind is the passing of Senator Ted Kennedy. And the reason why that comes to mind is because here you have two great leaders who had enormous longevity and enormous influence, but they spanned and in some sense represented a political era. Right? So think about the period in which John McCain served, the decades over which he served. Politics in the United States fundamentally changed in that period, and his career in some sense was about riding that change. The challenging primary with George Bush,
South Carolina in 2000. Yes.
Right, and the challenge for John McCain, a man of enormous principle, navigating the ways in which the internal politics of the Republican Party were shifting, the norms of political campaigns were shifting, and his having to learn how to adapt to a new political context, which he ultimately did to get the nomination in 2008, right down to the recent past where he's grappling with a Donald Trump presidency and something that obviously offended him to his core because it represented a seismic change in American politics.
Was he an old-fashioned politician?
I think in a sense he was. He was old-fashioned in the sense that he formed deep relationships with people of his own party and those across the aisle, and you've been able to speak to that this evening. We've lost that in American politics today, and he worked that aspect of the congressional dynamic every day, building relationships across the aisle. Famously, Joe Lieberman, who was a Democrat and in some ways was his closest friend and colleague, and that's now vanished. So in that sense, old-fashioned, but I think interestingly adaptable, right? So he understood the media environment. He's been still active in American politics up until his final days, tweeting and figuring out how to be engaged in the political scene. So I think, yes, old school, but not a dog that couldn't learn new tricks.
Well, the new tricks that this dog learned, will they be taught and learned, to others and by others? I mean, in other words, we could talk about the legacy of John McCain in a variety of ways, and we have done so tonight. But when you spoke with him on a one-to-one basis, civility in Washington was always top of mind. He just loved the idea of disagreeing with someone and then going and have dinner with them later, or maybe a drink or two. I mean, that doesn't seem to exist anymore. Can it return? And can the legacy of John McCain help it return?
I think it can, but I think that
to others and by others. I mean, in other words, we could talk about the legacy of John McCain in a variety of ways, and we have done so tonight. But when you spoke with him on a one-to-one basis, civility in Washington was always top of mind. He just loved the idea of disagreeing with someone and then going and have dinner with them later, or maybe a drink or two. I mean, that doesn't seem to exist anymore. Can it return? And can the legacy of John McCain help it return?
I think it can, but I think that there have been some fundamental shifts in politics in the United States. And this word civility is a tricky word. It implies that we're all nice to each other. Well, John McCain, I'm not his closest friend. I would never claim to be. But I know the man well enough to know that he probably wasn't always the nicest guy.
Oh, he could be very partisan.
Right, and also, probably give as good as he got, right?
Oh, sure.
But I think he dealt with others as human beings, and what struck me in the opportunities I had to interact with John McCain, the person, is what a rich and multifaceted human he was. And the challenge of contemporary Congress is that members don't interact with each other as humans very much. The 24-hour media cycle, the constant campaign, the partisanship, the flying back and forth to the district, which is much more dramatic now than it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago, that's changed that dynamic quite a bit. And so, yes, I think the model that John McCain leaves is an important one, but I don't think we can simply wipe away the reality of why that doesn't exist. And there's a second point, which is one of the reasons why John McCain was able to be the John McCain we celebrate tonight was his unique narrative and this unique position he occupied by virtue of his war heroism and his stature, which allowed him, quite frankly, to get away with stuff. Well, this is the truth. But to get away with stuff that others, quite frankly, could not.
And yet, the President of the United States has referred to that as being somehow of a lesser quality. You got captured. My heroes aren't those who got captured. I mean, something that seems so sacrosanct in this climate is not.
Yeah, and that's an astonishing thing, and we could have a whole conversation of why that disparagement of John McCain and his record was not disqualifying. Right, that's a whole separate topic. I don't think many people share that view, and certainly if you want to ask, what was it that gave John McCain his moral legitimacy to take principled stands? It did have to do with his unassailable record of being a man of incredible courage and fortitude. I'm sure you read his book, Accounting of that experience, and I honestly can't imagine what it was like to come through that. But more importantly than the coming through that and emerging on the other side whole, but to come through that and then be able to live a life of challenge and ups and downs and not be consumed by that experience, and in fact have a very optimistic bearing towards the future and not be in some sense consumed and haunted by that history. That's an incredible thing, and I think anybody who interacted with the man had to be struck by that and had to say, hey, I may disagree with this guy, but nobody can question his patriotism, nobody can question where he comes from. And that's a platform that most people don't have. And by the way, again, analogous to Ted Kennedy, right? So Ted Kennedy lost both of his brothers, well, multiple brothers, to public service, right? His older brother killed in the war, his two brothers assassinated. This is a man who knows what sacrifice for public service means, and I think that made a difference when Ted Kennedy, even when he was dealing with adversaries. So that's why I think there's an analogy between these two towering giants of the Senate.
That's an interesting analogy. Before you go, what did Senator McCain want from the McCain Institute? What were his goals?
I think what he saw looking out in the world was a lack of resources for people who wanted to serve as leaders. He looked, and by the way, it's important to note that was not an American vision. Right? John McCain was the consummate internationalist, and I think one of his frustrations with contemporary politics, to get to some of the stuff you're talking about, was that we were becoming overly narrow and not seeing the world. And John McCain saw the world. And so he wanted to create an institute that offered the resources for a new generation of leaders to pick up the mantle and to prepare them to do so. I'm dean of a college of public service. We draw inspiration from John McCain's model. I am struck by the millions upon millions of young people who are motivated to serve. But the motivation to serve isn't necessarily enough. You have to be given the tools to serve and the resources to understand how do you make a difference and how do you navigate this landscape. That's what John McCain was committed to with the McCain Institute. And I think that it is a really fitting legacy for him.
Jonathan Koppell is the Dean of the College of Public Service at ASU. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming in.
No, it's my pleasure. And you know, I'm sitting here thinking like all of your guests about the legacy, the career, the so on. But I got to tell you, Ted, I had the opportunity, much to my surprise, I showed up in Arizona, about 10 years ago, and got to work with Senator McCain and got to know him, which was an unexpected pleasure. I didn't know that. And what I'm remembering as much as the history is the person.
Yes.
The guy was an incredible character, warm, funny, self-deprecating. You got a sense of who he was immediately from interacting with him. And it doesn't come through necessarily on the television, but I think it's important when we remember a person. He's not a cardboard cutout, he's not a statue.
Sure.
He was a live human being, and he was a charming, warm fellow.
You got a sense of who he was, and you got a sense of what he wanted, too.
But that he didn't, but he didn't interact with people on the basis of what he wanted from them solely. Right. He saw people and enjoyed them. He was very warm with people that he wasn't going to get anything from them. Right.
Oh, sure.
Whether it was students or soldiers that he was interacting with, and he got to know them and looked them in the eye and made a joke. And I just think he was a very down-to-earth guy to the last, notwithstanding everything that he accomplished and everything that he did and all the places he'd been and all the people he had seen. He still could interact with you on the human level, and I remember that, and I'm remembering that tonight as we mourn his loss.
Dean Koppell, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Senator Chuck Schumer of New York tweeted his thoughts about